As a reporter, I've traveled the Middle East for many years. It's an area that has always fascinated me, but in my work, I've mainly covered its war zones, its crises, and its tragedies. This journey, which takes me down the Silk Road in the footsteps of Marco Polo, gives me the opportunity of exploring the great historical and cultural significance of this part of the world, its ancient melting pot of peoples and civilizations that have contributed so much to our own. My journey through Iran takes me next to Qazvin, which was once a major stop on the caravan route. A city of 400,000 inhabitants nestled in the foothills of the spectacular Elburz mountain range. Qazvin marks the entrance to the lands historically associated with Persia, in contrast to the Kurdish and Azeri regions to the west and north of present-day Iran. The more you discover about this country, the more you realize that there's an ongoing conversation between the Iran of today and the Persia of the past. So much so that you sometimes get the feeling that you're actually treading in the footsteps of the merchants who traveled the Silk Road. Qazvin was easier to defend than Tabriz, and it became the capital of the empire under the dynasty of the Safavid Shahs in the 16th century. This was the last century of prosperity for trade on the Silk Road before the maritime routes took over. In unseating Tamerlane's Timurid dynasty, the Safavids became the first purely Iranian dynasty to reign after 500 years of dominance by Turks and Mongols. Their extraordinary architectural skills can be seen when we enter this caravanserai. Of course, you can't feel it, but it's maybe 5 or 10 degrees cooler here than it is out in the street, where we were a couple of minutes ago. The ventilation comes from the air vents that we see above us. The hot air goes out while the cold air circulates at ground level. In here, the temperature is quite pleasant. One of the things that strikes me the most about Iranians is that they have a deeply ingrained love of culture. It's obvious that culture plays a very important role in their lives, and not only among the elite. Anyone will be happy to tell you about the great events in Persian history, the great poets, the great builders. And the journalist, Atifeh Hosseini, is no exception to the rule. She works for the local newspaper in Qazvin and certainly has a lot to say. Was a caravanserai actually more like a hotel or a bazaar, a group of shops?
Both of them together. This place was on the Silk Road, as you know, and many people stopped here. Since they needed somewhere to stay, there were places in which they could be housed, something like today's hotel rooms. And at the same time, it was useful for the people of Qazvin. This place was like a bazaar, like a market for them. In other words, they could come and sell their products to the people who were staying here, and so it also had an economic function.
You're very passionate about the Silk Road, but is it something that interests young Iranians nowadays at the beginning of the 21st century?
My interest in the Silk Road comes from my love of Iranian history, of the past, of the ancient culture of this country. We can't say that all Iranians are knowledgeable about the history of their country, but the number of people for whom it is important, who do research and who have a lot of knowledge about our history is really quite high. The truth is that in most cities in Iran, history is alive, and you can't say that those cities don't have any identity.
This caravanserai is like a palace, which tells us that Qazvin was once a major capital. But now, in comparison to other cities in Iran, it's quite small with 500,000 inhabitants. So are there a lot of cultural activities for you to cover as a journalist here?
In this city, there are a lot of people from different backgrounds, so you have a whole variety of cultures here, and that gives you a lot to write about. That's one of my favorite subjects, and I'd like to delve into it more later on to make social documentaries. The last article I wrote was about women and the economic crisis. It was called Living on a Mine. It was about women who have to beg in the streets and how to find solutions to help them stop. Because if it's painful to beg, it's even worse for women.
Without doubt, the history of their country matters a lot to Iranians, and in particular, the history of Jadeh-e Abrisham, the Silk Road. A little further on, as we meander through the bazaar, I find out that the city of Qazvin has even created a special Silk Road office and appointed an international representative to handle the subject. I'm very surprised to see that Iran has an office dedicated to the Silk Road. When did you set it up and why?
About 10 years ago, an NGO called WCO, the World Citizens Organization, decided to start up a discussion in Korea between the mayors of cities located on the Silk Road. Their aim was to reconstruct the Silk Road, not physically, but as a functional and cultural entity. If one considers its origins, the Silk Road is a route, one might say a space, that connects different cultures and traditions. The 11th summit was held from the 2nd to the 5th of September 2016 in the city of Qazvin. It brought together the mayors of 200 cities in 67 countries around the world, from Southeast Asia to Western Europe.
You say that there are 67 countries on the Silk Road Committee, but what I don't understand is that from Turkey to China, there aren't in fact 67 countries. Who are the members of your organization?
You're right, there aren't 67 countries along the Silk Road. And even all of the cities in our own country, Iran, are not actually on the Silk Road. In reality, it's become a pretext for creating a connection between different peoples and different cities, and it's based on mutual respect between the peoples and traditions that exist in all of these countries.
In short, this project launched by the WCO, or World Citizens Organization, is a little vague. But what is interesting is how proud certain countries, especially Iran and China, have become of their historical ties to the Silk Road. Traveling from Qazvin, one heads into the Elburz Mountains, a vast chain of peaks rising to over 5,671 meters at Mount Damavand, north of Tehran. For a long time, these mountains were a favorite hideout for bandits and caravan looters, but they weren't the only ones here. For several centuries, these remote valleys also provided shelter for a sect known as the Nizaris, who in the 10th century broke away from the Ismailis, who themselves were an offshoot of Shia Islam. As Muslims, they were thus a minority within a minority, a group that was often persecuted. This is an amazing sight. It's just spectacular. We're over 2,000 meters above sea level. It's like an eagle's nest. This place is called Alamut. It's the fortress of the old man on the mountain, Hassan-i Sabbah, the founder of the Ismaili sect known as the Hashshashins. They were called Hashshashins because they grew hashish, which Hassan-i Sabbah would give to his young recruits to smoke. He'd have them spend a few days in a beautiful garden, meet virgin girls, etc. He made them believe they were in paradise, then he'd take the hashish away. The guys were in withdrawal, they were junkies. Then he'd say, "Go kill one of my enemies for me." It might be a Muslim emir or one of the leaders of the Crusades. After you murder him, you'll go straight to heaven. You'll be killed right away, but you'll go and live in paradise. And since the guys wanted to get their drugs back, to return to that heavenly garden and be with those girls again, they would go and do it. So that's how they got the name Hashshashin, smoker of hashish, which is the word assassin comes from. Basically, Hassan-i Sabbah invented suicide bombing. A wonderful novel by Amin Maalouf tells the story of the friendship between the old man on the mountain and Mani, the prophet of Manichaean dualism, and the great mystic poet Omar Khayyam. It's called The Gardens of Light. I read it as a teenager, and since then I've always dreamed of visiting Alamut, or at least what is left of it. The solitude of the Elburz Mountains will soon give way to the noise and crowds of Tehran, the Iranian capital, with its skyscrapers and monstrous traffic jams. Tehran is built on the southern slopes of the Elburz Mountains at 1,300 meters above sea level. From the top of the city, you can hop onto a chairlift that will take you straight up to the ski slopes. This may be the only capital in the world that turns into a ski resort during the winter season. Tehran is a city that has mushroomed in the last 25 years, tripling in size to nearly 15 million people. If you look behind me, you'll see how spread out it is. It's now 50 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers long. Hardly the small provincial town that travelers used to come across on the old Silk Road. This flourishing megacity also testifies to the extraordinary flair for business and trade that the Persians and then the Iranians have always had. They dominated the Silk Road very early on and controlled the routes from India and China to present-day Turkey and Europe. What is perhaps the most surprising thing about Tehran is the contrast between the two Irans. One, which is rather hidebound, the Islamic Republic with its huge portraits of the Ayatollah Khomeini and its slogans against America, the great Satan. And the other, a country of young people, a capital in full economic boom, impatiently waiting for the sanctions connected with the nuclear conflict to be lifted. Iran is constantly navigating between these paradigms, like those women who are playing sports in sweatsuits, while also wearing the mandatory hijab. Or those couples who are flirting discreetly in spite of the ban imposed by the religious police. This is Laleh Park, one of the big parks in central Tehran, a lush oasis in the midst of this gargantuan metropolis and a favorite hangout for the local chess players.
Assalamu alaikum.
From what I can see, they're very good players, which is quite logical since this is, in fact, the homeland of chess. The first historical reference to the game they call shatranj, which is an Arabic word, was in Iran, or rather in Persia, in 600 BC. There are several theories about where the game comes from. Nowadays, most people agree that it originated in India, but was formalized and popularized in Iran. Then it was brought to Spain by the Arabs around the 10th century. That's how Europeans were introduced to this game, and they developed a passion for it during the Middle Ages. According to the legend, in the 6th century, an Indian ambassador brought the game of four kings, or shatranj, to the court of Khosrow I, the emperor, or Shah of Persia, in order to test his intelligence. In reality, the game probably circulated among the nomadic peoples of Central Asia before it arrived in Persia via the trade routes. And the same nomads would later bring it with them to the Arabian Peninsula. In fact, Ali, who was married to Fatima, the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, was an avid chess player. From Arabia, the game traveled via the Arab conquest to Andalusia, and from there it spread to the rest of Europe in the Middle Ages. So the game they play here, called shatranj, is basically the same as the chess that's played in Europe, but the terms they use are either Indian or Iranian. So the king is, well, the king. The queen is not a lady in Iran, but the vizier, a minister. And it's not the bishop here, but rather the elephant. Beyond that, however, the way the pieces are moved is the same as in the Western version. In the Arab regions, the game of chess was soon banned by purist Muslim theologians based on the Quranic precept that the use of figurines representing the human form is impious. The pieces thus took on a form that is usually abstract and identifiable via its designs. In Persia, on the other hand, the pieces often kept their figurative shape, such as, for example, the horse.
Sit down, please. Yes. What is Shekaran? Alfred. But my level is. He's asking, do you know the variant?
To everyone's astonishment, I won. Chess belongs to the traditional Indo-Oriental roots of Persia. But the Iran of today is not at all a monolithic bloc. There's an intermingling of influences from the East as well as from the West. The traditions of the past encounter the new trends embraced by the younger generation, which often yearns for a more modern, more open society. Slim jeans, bandanas, an electro remix by Pink Floyd blasting in the background. Iranian youth are thoroughly imbued with American culture. In the end, the Silk Road was just as much about exchanges between cultures as it was between trade and commerce. And here in Tehran, we can see that those cultural exchanges are still going on today, although it's no longer on the backs of Bactrian camels, but on the back of the internet. For example, around us in the skate park, we can see the influence of American culture. It may seem a little paradoxical since America officially remains the great Satan in the eyes of the Shiite clerics who rule the country, but this skate park is perfectly legal.
Salam.
Salam.
Hi Mickey, so how old are you and how long have you been skateboarding?
I'm 19 years old and I'm skating for like 6 years and a half.
How long have people been skateboarding in Iran?
Around 20 years, 15 years. You know, it's in progress and people are skating more than ever, you know.
But when people began skating 20 years ago, that was when Iran was still very isolated, and above all from the United States. Skateboarding is totally American, so how do you deal with that contradiction?
You know, skateboarding is not, it's a way of life, you know. We don't combine them together, you know. When you skate, you know, when you skate with an American skater, you don't see, you know, things in between, you know. You just call that guy your brother. You know, people always ask us, you know, what's like that to be, you know, skating, you know, the American sport in Iran, when actually it's a fight between them, I don't know. But, you know, we call each other brothers, you know, and that's good. You know, we don't think where you're from, how you look, you know, we just skate.
You say it's not the look that counts, but from what I can see, the look seems to be a big thing. Everyone's wearing slim jeans, bandanas on their heads, hip t-shirts, so what's going on?
You know, it's because of what they listen to in music, you know. They listen to hip-hop, some of them listen to like metal or something like that. So, it's, I know what you mean, but it's, you know, everybody has a different, you know, style. But in, you know, when we speak, we have like the same thing to talk about. You know, people are more coming, you know, kids, you know, like 8 years old, 9 years old, they are skating. You know, it's in progress.
How much time do you spend skateboarding? And what do you like about this sport? Why are you so hooked on it?
I skate like 4 hours a day, you know, after work, you know, after university. And, you know, skateboarding is way different than what people think. You know, they think that it's just a hobby. But nah, it's like, you know, it changed a lot of things in my life. You know, my behavior, you know, my attitude, and, you know, the way I dress, the way I mean, you know, clothes on. It's hard to explain, you know. It's like you are free when you skate. You don't have to think about tomorrow, you don't have to think about the past. You just skate and, you know, you are happy. You actually are happy, you know what I'm saying? And that's it. You know, it's the best thing that ever happened.
Montesquiou.
خواهش می‌کنم.
Right next to the skate park is the Tabiat Bridge, the nature bridge in Persian. The concept is more or less the same, a bold display of modernity with a stamp of approval from the Iranian authorities. This suspension bridge right in the heart of Tehran is quite astonishing, especially since it was designed by a young female architect. As you walk along this new bridge of size, you'll notice that here in the Iranian capital, the young women are extremely made up, often to the point of using plastic surgery. Moreover, they have a very minimalist approach to wearing the headscarf imposed by the regime. Circumventing social mores is a subtle art practiced by today's young couples, who indulge in the delights of flirting on this bridge. On the outskirts of the capital, there's a military zone where I find the oldest sport in the country being practiced, polo. For thousands of years, there was just one item that was essential to the Chinese, an imported item, and that was the horse. They started buying horses from the Persians in 200 BC and continued to do so for 2,000 years. The only horses they sought were Persian horses called blood sweaters. Some historians believe that these heavenly horses that seem to sweat blood were in fact victims of a parasite that made their skin bleed. It's true that they were the fastest horses in the world, and those were the horses they played polo with. If there's one sport that is emblematic of the Silk Road, it's polo, which the Persians called the king of sports and the sport of kings. Polo spread up and down the Silk Road to China in the east and towards Byzantium in the west. It's a sport that's been played from 500 BC until the present day. Hi there, little foal. Marco Polo says that the Persian charger was the most highly prized horse in the world, and that it sold for 200 Turin pounds, which apparently was an enormous sum. Hey, don't eat me. So imagine that little guy, 200 Turin pounds. So, here we have the ball and the polo stick. The Iranian name for polo is shogan, which means mallet. According to the legend, Alexander the Great received a ball and a mallet from Darius, the king of Persia, which basically meant, "You're just a kid, keep playing." Alexander is said to have told him, "You see this ball? Well, it's the earth, and this mallet is me." Which shows what he thought of himself. But in fact, as history would prove, he knew what he wanted and he went after it. Considered an aristocratic sport, polo was banned by the Ayatollah Khomeini after the 1979 revolution that brought about the fall of the Shah Reza Pahlavi. 10 years later, however, polo was rehabilitated because of its significance for the country's cultural history. Amir Ali Zulfikari is a big fan of polo. How many horses are needed to play in a polo match?
You need at least four ponies, 4 horses, polo ponies, because you're not supposed to repeat in a match more than twice, depending on the number of chukkas or periods in the match. Normally in the lower levels of polo, with 4 is enough. As you go to higher level of matches, you might need up to 10 each player. Yeah, you need plenty.
I'm not really going to play, huh? It's okay.
So in fact, polo was invented by the Scythians, a nomadic people who roam the northern parts of Iran. The Emperor of Persia made them his cavalry. And in fact, we can see why, because polo is actually an excellent way of training. It was adopted by the cavalry. It's like a way of training for the battle before the real match. The Chinese believed that these horses came from the Fergana Valley, which is now in Uzbekistan. In fact, the Persian dealers traded for them on farms throughout all of Central Asia and present-day Iran.
The polo ponies nowadays is a mixed race, special race. In the higher level of polo, the thoroughbred, English thoroughbred race is used, the same as a racehorse. And we use the Turkmen horse mixed with the thoroughbred. The Turkmen horse mixed with the Arab or with the Kurdish horse as well is used a lot. And they do very well.
The mare that I rode, Little Bird, is a good example of this. At the slightest pull on the reins, she twirls around and she can even stop in full gallop. Now it's time to leave Tehran, this time by train. To get to the city of Kashan, we'll be crossing a part of Dasht el-Kavir, the Big Salt Desert.